I remember it was still snowing. That's all I really remember. So last time I took us through the history of anti-Semitism, it's a lot. I'm gonna quickly give us a little refresher, just so that we're at least kind of on the same baseline, for understanding at least what JCA's analysis of anti-Semitism is, because everybody's gonna have slightly different analyses, and the one that we present, we try to go and have something that covers pretty much everybody's, right? Everybody might have specific things. We don't do the checklist of this is an anti-Semitism, this is not. We like to look at the big picture. Where did it come from? And how do we still see it showing up today because of where it came from? So, next slide.
Mhm.
I thought I muted this slide.
I don't know. Which, sorry.
Oh. Yeah, okay.
Let me, hold on. Let's try.
If you exit out of it and then open it again, I think it
That's what
should,
I'm thinking too.
because if you scroll up, I'll be able to tell. Yeah, okay, so if you,
Now I'll start the.
now if you start it, I think we should be good. And it shouldn't show us that picture of George Soros anymore. It's my usual case study to start things, but we did that last time. I'll summarize that one. Basically, that's a cornucopia of a ton of different anti-Semitic dogmas. Pile of money, rich old white Jew, also like you have, this is working perfect.
Yeah.
But
now I'm way too far.
Yeah, now you're way too far. Just go back up to the front.
Oh, wait, where's the front? Oh my God.
Other direction. All right.
Yep, G1.
Okay. So I do have a newer example from last time I was here. So another key part of a lot of anti-Semitic and specifically white nationalist movements today is basically for those who follow the Marvel Cinematic Universe, there's a Marvel Cinematic Universe of anti-Semitic dog whistles. Of tons and tons of different conspiracy theories that are just constantly added on to each other. The same way they come out with a new Marvel movie every year that is part of the same universe, there is a new addition to these conspiracy theories to go and meet related that don't like. So some anti-trans literature dropped by a white nationalist group. This was in Atlanta earlier this year. And some really big parts to know about this. This is from the same white nationalist group that has dropped literature here in the Twin Cities. They've done it in many places. It's really about the same 8 guys. They just drive around the country doing this. But it still is absolutely terrifying to get these. And this is one where this group of neo-Nazis, and these are specifically neo-Nazis, blame the existence of trans people on specifically Jews. And this actually leads to a much older Nazi ideology, because what many people don't realize and know is that the first gender affirming clinic in the world was in Weimar, Germany, just before the Nazis took over. And the very first book burnings, the big images, the most popular images we see of book burnings out of Nazi Germany was the destruction of the library from the Institute of Sexual Studies. So here in this, there are granules of truth. They have Magnus Hirschfeld, the man who opened that clinic. Here, and they say, well, he was a Jewish sexologist who would introduce the concept of transgenderism and is now trying to convert people. That's obviously the BS part. But it is true that there was a German Jewish man who was very, very dedicated to sexual studies and queer identities. They didn't have the same verbiage back then, but he was a pioneer in these fields. This man is honestly a hero for the amount of work that he did for queer communities a century ago. But this white nationalist myth is a big part of their tactic, where they will go and this man right here, Joel Swanson, is a researcher of anti-Semitism. Highly recommend following him if you still use Twitter. But a big part of this is that these movements will often go and blame Jews in order to also simultaneously take away an entire group's agency. It cannot possibly be trans people and queer people organizing for their own liberation, organizing to educate people, speaking out on their own accord. It can't be Black Americans organizing on their own, winning civil rights battles. It has to be somebody else. Because if you subscribe to an ideology where you believe that people are lesser, where you believe that they're subhuman, it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense if you're losing to that. Because if you're supposedly the superior race, if you're supposedly better at all of these things, then why do you keep losing? Well, the answer within this ideology of white nationalism is, well, it's the Jews. It's kind of the Scooby-Doo, I would have gotten away with it if it weren't for you meddling kids type of approach. So that's an important thing to be thinking about how these ideologies work, because even though they seem illogical to us, they have their own internal logics. And when we understand their internal logics, we can actually better understand how they're going to go and move and operate. So next slide, please.
You.
All right, so a little historical background. Is there a button thing? I can almost hit it if there's a remote.
No.
Ah, darn.
I
All right, so quickly running through these, what I tried to establish last time is when we're thinking about how anti-Semitism and also how racism work, when we're thinking about these larger oppressions, we need to be thinking about what is the shared aspect. When we pull the thread up, where do we see a lot of these things kind of erupt from? And they erupt from the last 400 years of societal change, specifically from European colonization. That's at least where our understandings here in the United States come from. Our understandings of race come from the fact that we were a European colony. We have a lot of European holdover laws, a lot of European culture. So when we're talking about this doesn't mean this is the case everywhere. It looks the same everywhere. Just here in the US, this is what's really influenced it. So what I want us to know from this is that colonization and imperialism, those are constantly ongoing. They weren't just one time period. It wasn't just when a country owns another country on a map. That's a process. Colonization is the process of removing people from their lands and replacing them with new people from somewhere else. And it's usually marked by genocides and enslavement. And also in the case of something where it's a traditional colony, Britain and the 13 colonies, resources are extracted and sent back to the homelands. Imperialism, similarly, it's not just owning a country on a map. It did not end when Britain lost its empire. It still continues today. A great example would be most of West Africa, the countries that were formerly colonized by France. Most of those countries still have to go and bank in a fictional currency called the colonial French franc. So they have to collect all of their tax revenues, send it to France to be banked in France in a completely different currency than their local currencies, and then be able to go and convert it again, allowing French bankers to go and keep the money on. So that's an example of how imperialism can still continue even if you don't see it on a map. These are important to think about because this means that there's a lot of really big systems of oppression still happening today that we sometimes aren't thinking about because they aren't as visible on the surface. But they lead to a lot of cracks, and that's where white nationalism and fascist movements come in, because when there's cracks in the surface, they will find ways to go and exploit it. Think of them as that wedge coming in, cracking it open. So next slide. And with this European origin, when we're thinking about oppressions here in the United States, European oppressions that came into US culture and Canadian culture is indigenous people in the Americas are erased through genocide, through the school systems where they're functionally re-education camps. European oppression of Africans looks like exploitation, not just enslavement, but also the sharecropping system, also things like Jim Crow, also the continuing nature of how our entire minimum wage economy works, where it's actually really impossible to go and advocate for yourself within a system where you can be fired at will at any time for speaking up. Those are all examples of how exploitation works and how they most focus on marginalized communities. But European oppression of Jews looks like scapegoating. And last time I talked quite a bit about that, so I'm going to really skip through that today. But it comes from a much longer history, largely through the Christianization of Europe. Though Jews have faced oppression long before Christianity came around, the pharaohs no longer exist. The Babylonian Empire no longer exists. We don't have holdovers from their cultures. We do have holdovers from the end of Rome. When Rome transitioned into being Christianized, a lot of our laws still hold over from the way that Roman laws were built. And a lot of that culture that was built in Europe over those many centuries came through a singular church that dominated the political and cultural sphere. So that's where there is a Christian origin within the way that Jews are scapegoated. Even if you see it in places like the the Middle East, when you go and you look at the ways in which Jews are described, they come from the same types of stories that came out of Europe, because those stories came there through colonization. Doesn't mean that people aren't anti-Semitic in other places. It just means when we trace the origin, we pull the thread back and it originates in Europe. So that gets us to Christian hegemony. That's the predominance of Christian values in a society. It's kind of like this low hum under the surface. When everybody in the room is Christian, no matter what the denomination, it's really easy to forget or not know what other communities need, what their beliefs are, what their holidays are. So a great example of how Christian hegemony can show up, whether or not it's intentional, would be in Minneapolis this year. The Minneapolis City Council held rent control while 3 members were absent for Eid observances. This is a great example of, it actually doesn't matter whether or not this was intentional. There was a big debate on whether or not it was. But when a quarter of your city council is out for a major holiday, and you go and you pass a something that is final for a policy, great example of Christian hegemony, because even if not all of them are Christian, it's a really great example to see, wow, if you didn't think through what other people's holidays and observances are, you can kind of bulldoze through them whether or not you meant it. Other examples would be how public school calendars will favor maybe Easter, but won't include Eid, or won't include Rosh Hashanah. These are good examples of how just the predominance of that Christian culture in a space can lead to further marginalization of people, whether or not it's intentional. We're not looking at the morality of whether it's intentional, just how things can hum along in the background just by being where we are. So this is now getting, I'm trying to establish that baseline. I hope I'm not going too far too fast, because I want to get us to the actual white nationalism parts. So first, I want us to be thinking about what is whiteness. Whiteness is a concept that began as a social designation in the colonial Americas. That's why I wanted to establish that we need to be thinking about colonialism. So it started there. And then it became enforced by law internationally by Europeans. So whiteness first starts as a fix to problems within the indentured servitude system, where they're bringing over people from Europe and saying, you can work for us for 7 to 10 years, and if you survive the harsh conditions, you're free. They also were doing the same thing for Africans. But then quickly they saw that Europeans and Africans who were indentured were starting to go and work together. They did not like that, so then they created separate designations. Africans could no longer be freed after 7 years, while Europeans could be. And this is where the concepts of whiteness began. It was much easier to demarcate between your laboring population, between their skin color, than it was going through all the legal documents, especially in a time where it's all big reams of paper in some place probably about like 40 miles away, which takes you about 3 days to get to back then. So whiteness was a fix for that social problem, but then it became enforced by law internationally by Europeans. These were all European colonies. They started going and exporting them back home to Europe. They started sending them to other colonies. This becomes pretty much the template for how a lot of these laws operate around the world. And at this time, European colonialism expands greatly. You start seeing it expand far beyond the Americas to other places. And by the 18th and 19th centuries, during that big time that we know as the Enlightenment, there's this boom of science, this boom of thought. Well, not all of the science and thought from that time period was necessarily correct or good. It's nice to go and look back and be like, look, we conquered this fear of the unknown. But also, there was a lot of bad stuff out of there, and that includes race science. And whiteness became legitimized, and I use air quotes here, in the fields of science and biology, as race scientists went and said, well, all of these legal designations that we've had for 300 years now within the colonial world, well, they're just a natural offshoot of how the natural order of things are. And they use this concept of nature to go and say, well, we wouldn't have these laws if it weren't the nature of the world. These laws are a must because there are levels of inferiority and superiority between different groups of people. So it became legitimized through these fields of science. And whiteness, as many people know, didn't always apply to every single person from Europe. It's a social designation. It changed over time. And in the United States, whiteness first starts with white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, your classic kind of WASP type of thing. But then it starts expanding to more groups. At first, Catholics weren't included. At first, Irish people weren't included. Italians weren't included. But it begins to expand. Basically, as you begin to assimilate and you lose those aspects of your original culture, be it your language, your food, your stories, and you start to go and act more like the majority culture, that is when you become deemed white by the rest of society. So that's why whiteness has changed over time. It's not purely just based off of your phenotype the moment you get off the boat at Ellis Island. It's also based off how much you act like the rest of society. How much of your original culture do you sell away in order to go and make it in America? That's what whiteness looks like. And it looks similar in other places. It looks like that in Canada. It looks like that in other places as well. Assimilation is a core part, which brings us to nationalism. Wanted to break these two apart. So nationalism is a concept that a nation, a group of people, that can be any group of people, can only truly be represented by a formal state of government, borders, guns, etc. It further aims to build and maintain a single national identity based on shared social characteristics, which can be a lot of different things. It can be culture, it can be ethnicity, it can be language, it can be the geography that everyone is from. It can be any number of things. Nationalism in and of itself isn't necessarily a one-size-fits-all thing. It's a descriptor for a lot of different movements. So in the United States, we have a thing called civic nationalism, where our idea of our nationhood is built around our founding documents, the founding fathers, the Bill of Rights, all of that stuff. That's how we identify as a nation, where we identify largely with our democratic principles. While other places like France, being French is based off of you are born in France. You come from people who were French 2 centuries ago, and it's based off of your language and the geography you were born in. Algerians who have been born in mainland France for 100 years still aren't considered French by the French. Even though by all other respects they are French, they aren't considered by French society to be French. It's not like here in the US, where once you've been here, you're American. Nationalism looks different in different places and to different groups because it's a political symbol. So next slide. So how is all of this relevant to today's presentation? Well, the forms of oppression we see today, they're culturally ingrained and they're formed and reinforced by all these changing social and economic relationships. These things don't appear out of nowhere. They're not ideology is not something that's contagious that you just catch one day. If you read the wrong book, you're just going to magically turn into a bad person. That's not how it works. There has to be some sort of underlying social or material changes that are happening that actually antagonize you into wanting to identify with those various things. Because it's really, really hard to go and get somebody to wish harm upon, to want to do harm to another person. You have to do a lot of inculcating them to get them to that point. Anti-Semitism and racialization are direct results of these big economic shifts. And what I mean by that is that as we know them today, anti-Semitism obviously existed prior to the enclosures in the 1600s, but it looked very different. It didn't have these stories of Jews being in control of the world. It had stories more along the lines of Jews being sinister or devil-like, because back then Jews lived in shtetls. They were walled off from the rest of society, and they were largely viewed as different through a religious lens, rather through today where it's anti-Semitism creates an economic descriptor. Jews control the finances of the world. Jews control the politics of the world. 500 years ago, the anti-Semitism was Jews are different because they speak a different language, they use and they haven't accepted Christ. That was how anti-Semitism was animated 500 years ago. Today, those flavors still remain, but the main driving force of every anti-Semitic conspiracy theory you hear, usually when people are anti-Semitic, their leading thing isn't, well, they killed Christ. Nowadays, it's they control the world. They control X, Y, or Z. It's about control in those stories today, not about that religious component, though the religious component appears from time to time. In the 21st century, we're super interconnected as a global society, and we need to understand that these large cultural notions can't be viewed in isolation in time and space. We can't view them as a little tiny slice. We can't understand the civil rights movement if we only look at the years 1954 to 1964. It's really hard to understand race in America if you're only looking at a 10-year time span. There's a lot of context that you'll be missing, and the same goes for any other form of oppression or movement. And lastly, I kind of touched on this. All of these major social changes, create a whole bunch of tears and fabrics of communities and cultures, which we can just call social malaise. I got it from a book studying fascist movements in the US in the 1940s. But when we think about social malaise, we have to think about not everything's great. We can admit that things aren't going good right now, right? Politically, economically, climatologically, things aren't necessarily great. People feel worried. That's what social malaise is. And when people feel worried, when people feel anxious, it is easier to go and animate them and redirect them towards something other than a real fix, right? There are good fixes. We can go and do things in our community. Many of us in this room do that all the time. We do food shelves. We go and we talk to our elected officials. We work with people in our communities to go and make it better. Those are ways of fixing social malaise that are good. Fascists and white nationalists look at social malaise, they look at that social anxiety and they say, this is an opportunity for me to be able to agitate groups of people into performing violence on people that I don't like. So, next slide. Anti-Semitism as a structure, we might actually just be able to skip this because I think I already talked through it. It's a set of stories and myths, and it's largely created to protect people in power. I will note real quick, Semitism, why is it called anti-Semitism? Well, it's because this racist dweeb in the 1800s wanted to go and rebrand an older religious form of anti-Semitism that was called the Judenhass, Jew hate. And this is during that height of industrialization, the scientific revolutions of the 1800s. He wanted to get on the race science craze that was already big at the time. Think the measuring of skull sizes, phrenology and stuff. He wanted to get in on that, so he stole the word Semitic from the world of linguistics, which Semitic languages describe Hebrew, Aramaic, Arabic, a variety of languages are Semitic. So sometimes you'll hear people say, well, you know, how can I be anti-Semitic? I'm pro-Arab and pro-Jewish, and they're both Semitic peoples. Well, that's using linguistic terminology instead of knowing what anti-Semitism is. Anti-Semitism is the descriptor for this dweeb's worldview, which became hyper-popularized, which is the idea that Jews are a sinister, inferior race that whenever they're inside of society is going to undo it from within. They're going to get inside of your society. They're going to, you know, work like termites. You know, a lot of that Nazi type of ideology comes right out of his stuff. So why he calls it anti-Semitism? Well, if there is a cultural inclination of a group of people to come into your society and destroy it, it would only be naturally logical to be anti that, to be against that. So that's why he called it anti-Semitism. He proudly called it this. He was like, hey, everybody, there's a Semitic conspiracy out to get us. We have to be against that Semitic conspiracy. So that's why it's called that. And that's why you'll see it anti-capital S Semitism. There's also lots of internal debates about whether or not you should do that. I subscribe to the idea of anti-Semitism, one word, no dash, because if you do anti-dash Semitism, capital S, it implies that Semitism is a real thing. So fun thoughts about words. Next slide. This is just something I put together from just lots and lots of reading I've done of how anti-Semitic narratives have changed over time. This will be available afterwards, but the point is that it's changed a lot since the Roman Empire, where it's targeting religion. It's saying Jews are outdated. You know, Christians have the new covenant with God. You have to upgrade to the 2.0 version of the covenant. Later on, it becomes Jews are sinister, blaming them for the plague, blood libel. All of these things appear during the Middle Ages, and then this is where and why I talk about the enclosures and everything. When the Spanish Reconquista happens and they kick all of the Jews and Muslims out of Spain, they also develop the first race-based laws. These are the first times you will see laws based off of the one drop rule, similar that we had in the United States around segregation, where if you have just one drop of African-American ancestry, you were deprived of rights in the United States. The same went in Spain. If you had one drop of Moorish ancestry or Jewish ancestry, you were deprived of rights in Spain, and that was in 1492. So during this period is when we see this period of the development of capitalism through the enclosures, through colonization, through imperialism. That's when we start to see the concepts of racialization, financial control, and dual loyalty show up. Dual loyalty is the idea that Jews can't be loyal to the place that they live that they're always loyal to somewhere else. In that era, it was because Jews spoke various languages like Yiddish or Judeo-Provençal, or like lots of other local languages that combine Hebrew with whatever that local language was, be it German, French, Spanish. Ladino is a good example. But that was viewed as, you must be loyal to somewhere else. Because if you can speak the same language as somebody in Italy, that means you must be loyal to these Italians and not to the French. Dual loyalty existed long before the modern state of Israel. Nowadays, you can see that with the assumption that all Jews must be loyal to Israel, something that the former president says a lot. That's an example of the dual loyalty anti-Semitic trope, but it's existed for a long time. And then, of course, after World War II, we see the expansion of this concept of Jews control the banks to Jews control the world. And also, of course, targeting of Holocaust memory and saying the Holocaust didn't happen or was exaggerated. So anti-Semitism changed a lot over time. Next slide. So why do we need to understand all of this now? Anti-Semitism works in relationship with racism and xenophobia to divert people away from the systems oppressing them. Just doing a time check. And we can't change those systems if we buy into those diversions. Our movements need to learn about and be able to identify those underlying power structures, which I went into a lot last time. I'm kind of skipped through those this time, so we can get to the white nationalism component today. But if we don't think about how power functions, if we don't think about how geopolitics works, how culture works, we end up missing the forest for the trees. We end up going and focusing on one thing. Maybe we focus on the deployment of a slur trope in one instance instead of looking at the bigger picture. And we need to be looking at the bigger picture if we truly want to stop the spread of not just anti-Semitism, but lots of forms of racism and oppression. And this political moment is loaded with conspiracy theories, and a lot of them have direct roots in anti-Semitism, which I'm going to be getting more into in the white nationalism component. And it's important to understand this in order to unpack and undermine those when we see and hear them. So, next slide. White nationalism, American is apple pie, now a global export. So, first off, what's the difference between white supremacy and white nationalism? There actually is a difference. It actually bugs me a lot how often, especially like news media, gets this wrong and will use these interchangeably. As you can tell, I think a lot about the use of words, and this is an important one. So, white supremacy is this belief that white people, with an asterisk next to it, are superior to other people. And that also applies to systems that were founded by people with those beliefs. So you can have a white supremacist structure, even though maybe people don't necessarily believe that today. A great example is you may hear people go and say, well, the United States is a white supremacist system. It's system of government. Well, we were founded by a whole bunch of rich slave owners 270 years ago who did not necessarily have the interests of women or people of color or even really poor people at the time in mind. I mean, if you didn't own land, you didn't get the right to vote until 50 years into American independence. Non-landowners did not universally get the right to vote until Andrew Jackson in the 1820s. And that dude was a monster too. But white supremacy also can apply to, you don't have to be white to be a white supremacist. Because as I mentioned earlier, whiteness is a cultural identifier. It's that idea of if I act a certain way, if I give up certain things about my background, about the way I am, that I would be able to make it further in society, right? It's that American dream, but it's that nightmare that sits underneath. If you give up enough things, and if you just act the right way, you say the right things, good things will come to you. And that's what white supremacy ends up looking like. And it ends up favoring usually people with whiter skin, but it also can appear in places where people aren't necessarily considered white by all white supremacists, but they go and they advocate for lots of policies and conceptualizations that still end up creating this ranking of people. That I did it the right way, these people are dirt, and they didn't do it the right way. So white supremacy is a belief system. White supremacy can be something that many people can ascribe to because it's that set of all of those artificial societal norms of what is whiteness, a way to act, a way to be accepted in society. White nationalism says We like that so much that we want to make a nation state around it. We want to go and have a government explicitly based around that. And explicitly and exclusively for whichever white nationalist group we're talking to that day, considers white. Because they'll have lots of opinions. White nationalism is inherently white supremacist. A good way to summarize this is if we think about like high school geometry, squares and rhombuses. Remember, all squares are rhombuses, but not all rhombuses are squares. All squares are rhombuses, all white nationalists are white supremacists, but not all white supremacists are white nationalists. That's a really important distinction to make because you can have people who ascribe to elements of white supremacy, be it intentionally or unintentionally. But white nationalism is saying it's an intentional, I like this so much, I'm stepping on the gas pedal. So there's an intentionality behind white nationalism versus white supremacy is something you can see bubble up just in everyday society. People can just not know about it and accidentally, unintentionally be pushing things that are essentially white supremacists, but they've just never thought deeply about it. That doesn't mean they're a bad person because they haven't thought about it before. It's just how we grow up in our culture. Versus white nationalism says, I like it so much, I want that. So that's an important distinction. Next slide. So white nationalist ideology, what's it all about? Whites, asterisk next to it, are a biologically defined people. Every white nationalist group you'll run into will have different opinions on who counts as white. The vast majority would pretty much just say anybody from Europe who comes from a Christian European background. That's where the vast majority of white nationalist groups today identify as who is a biologically defined people. Occasionally you'll run into groups that are like Jews can count as long as they don't act too Jewish, which is how you end up having people like Stephen Miller, who was part of the Trump administration. That guy, firm white nationalist, like he's the guy who did a lot of the architecture for a lot of the really repulsive anti-immigrant policies during that administration. And that guy openly identifies as a white nationalist. And it confused people because they're like, well, he's Jewish. You can be Jewish and be a white nationalist. It just, not all white nationalists will necessarily welcome you. But you can by all means identify with white supremacy and say, I like it so much, I want a nation state around it. So whites has that asterisk because not all white nationalists will agree on who counts as white. But they will all agree on this part, that black people and other people of color are biologically inferior. That's a core part of white nationalism. And a key extension of that is, therefore, if a group is biologically inferior, that means any of their achievements present a logical and existential problem. Because if a group is inferior, well, then how can they have successes? They shouldn't have successes if they're less than. So that gets us to the next part. Well, Jews are a race within a white nationalist construction, a demonic conspiratorial race. That Semitism that was proposed by that racist dweeb Wilhelm Marr in 1879. And with this gives them the answer next. Because whatever success people of color in America have, or any other marginalized community, queer communities, are that example I used earlier, where the success and existence of trans people in this country are viewed as it must be a Jewish plot. Because whatever success people of color and other marginalized people have in America, Jews must be behind it.
Oh, sorry.
Because within this current construction of white nationalism, Jews form a cabal, a group behind the scenes, and are constantly using other groups as pawns to destroy white nationhood, to undo a nation from within. So now we can go to the next slide. So white nationalism has a long and uniquely American history, even though the concepts of whiteness originate from Europe. And a lot of these concepts of race science come out of Europe. The concept of white nationalism is a very American thing, because within Europe, all of the forms of European nationalism are based off of those other forms, your language, the geography you were born in. America presents this unique problem. You have all of these different people from European backgrounds, and they're all a little different, but they're all assimilating into this kind of blob of American culture, this whiteness. So white nationalism is kind of a one size fits all for all of these forms of European nationalism. Why must the countries of Europe fight each other? Why must white man versus white man go to war when it's the rest of the world that is the threat? That's the logic of white nationalism, that there is a universality of the Europeans versus the rest of the world. And this really comes out of America. So first we need to think about the period right after the Civil War, which I'm from Texas. In my school books, and it still is the case in the school books down there, the period right after the Civil War is called radical Reconstruction, to imply that it went too far. I would say Reconstruction did not go far enough. Most people don't realize this, but the Confederates, none of them were actually tried. There was no Nuremberg tribunals for the top level Confederates. They all just got to put their hand on a Bible and say, I won't do it again. And they got to be sheriffs, they got to be senators, they got to be congresspeople again. And that's why they were able to so quickly develop Jim Crow and edit, undo all of the successes that had come from the brief period of Reconstruction when it actually was in effect. Because Reconstruction was loosely enforced, ex-Confederates, they weren't punished. And instead, they waged a war of terror through the original plan in the 1870s. And then also they realized that history, we often think it's written by the victor. It's not. The Athenians lost the Peloponnesian Wars to the Spartans, but we don't remember the Spartans until that movie 300 came out. No one remembered the Spartans. Everybody remembered Athens. Everybody remembers Plato. Everybody remembers Socrates. But they lost. Well, it's because they wrote things down. Spartans didn't like writing things down. So the Confederates and their children realized that the way that they can win this war in the long term is through the pen, through reconstructing history, through rewriting it, and through creating this mythology of the lost cause. This idea that the Confederacy wasn't leaving because of slavery, it was states' rights. Don't ask what right for a state. That's not important. And on top of that, they created this idea of the Gone with the Wind aesthetic. That's the lost cause. Like lost cause refined is Gone with the Wind. This idea of the pre-Civil War South being a place of like chivalry and gentility. That is the concept of the lost cause. So they start going and building monuments to all these Confederate leaders that we're still arguing about today. They start rewriting the history books to go and say that, well, we didn't really for those reasons, and to tamp down on this stuff. And this becomes so popular that we also need to be thinking about the time period. Doing another time check. Okay, we're still good. When we think about this time period, this is the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. Technology is booming. You have the first telephones coming around, but those are a rich people thing. But you also have mass print media. You have people being able to go and buy paperbacks for a dime, which was like $10 back then. But still, they're able to go and buy short novellas and books, and then read them on the on their public transit rides to work. And a lot of the most popular books come out of the lost cause. They're either those Western books talking about the Wild West. If you're sitting in a streetcar in Ohio and you're reading about adventures on the plains of the Wild West, that's exciting. Or you're reading about the lost cause. You're reading about like chivalry in the South 80 years ago. It captures public imagination. And one of the most popular books during that time is this book called The Klansman. Yeah. And then it's adapted into the first feature-length film called Birth of a Nation. Birth of a Nation was the very first feature-length film. And this thing, President Woodrow Wilson, also not a good dude, no matter what your history books told you. He was not actually progressive. He was our only president born in the Confederacy, and he loved that movie so much, he screened it at the White House and then resegregated the Postal Service that Teddy Roosevelt had just desegregated. He also instituted the first Red Scare, which gets us to how white nationalism goes and really starts inculcating this long history of American anti-Blackness that we are quite familiar with, along with that European notion of anti-Semitism. This is where that notion of Jews coming into a society and undoing becomes hyper-popularized in the US. Because during the first Red Scare in 1919, not the Joe McCarthy one in the 40s, because we had two of them, the first Red Scare, which is often forgotten, is this moment of paranoia that suddenly the Russian Revolution must be coming to America's shores. And who must be responsible? Well, it must be all of these Eastern European Jews who are working in factories and who are daring to go and form unions with Black people. That was viewed as a threat to the racial order in the United States and the economic order. So an anti-communist paranoia sweeps the nation, and largely communities which are viewed as hotbeds of Bolshevism are targeted. And this is when we see what I will say. These were pogroms largely against Black communities across the US. Many people in the US are finally learning about the massacre in Tulsa in 1921. That's at the tail end of the first Red Scare. There also was a similar massacre in East St. Louis. There was many others across the South. Entire towns pushed into churches that were then burned down. And these are largely forgotten. And this stuff also was extremely big outside of the South. It's easy for us to go and think, especially if we've only grown up in the North, that, oh, it must be the backwards South. It's not, because during this time period, the Klan resurges to nearly 4 million members, largely due to the popularity of Birth of a Nation. And those 4 million members, these are card-carrying, you're paying dues. And you, back then, there is no direct deposit. There is no, I'm gonna go and do a recurring credit card transaction. You have to put that in an envelope and mail it and say, I like this group this much that I'm gonna go and do that. That's how you became a member of the Klan back then. So it's a real intention. It's not just, I decided one day that I'm gonna call myself that. You had to go and actually do a lot of work just to be part of that. And they have hit nearly 4 million members in the industrial Midwest. They're in Ohio. They are in Indiana. They are in Illinois. They are in Minnesota. They are in Wisconsin and Michigan. And a big part of this is also thanks to Henry Ford. Henry Ford is one of America's biggest anti-Semites. Not a good dude either. As much as our history books like to go and say, oh, he was so good, he started paying his workers $5 a day. One, it was a union busting strategy. Two, it was because at the same time, he was distributing his anti-Semitic screeds. So Henry Ford and anti-Semitism is a very interesting story. He takes a document from Tsarist Russia that was printed in 1903. So the Tsar of Russia, in addition to being morally bankrupt, was actually bankrupt in 1903 and wanted to go and redirect the inevitable uprising that would happen in 1905 towards Jewish communities, because there's a long history of stirring up pogroms against Jews. And the idea was, let's go and stir up pogroms against the Jews and blame them for why Russia is crumbling right now. The Tsar's secret police distributed it. It, of course, led to many pogroms. And this document is called the Elder Protocols of Zion. It is basically the template for most conspiracy theories you see today. It is supposed to be it's supposed to be the meeting minutes of a secretive group of rabbis plotting world domination, how they're just on the edge of it. And the point of distributing it is, you, everyday person, you can stop them. Think, it's the same type of thing you see with QAnon today, where it's like, you, reader on Facebook, I've given you the secret knowledge, and only you can go and rise up against these people who are behind the scenes. It's a similar logic. And it all starts with the Elder Protocols of Zion. So Henry Ford translates them and then starts reprinting them in the US and starts distributing them, printing them in the newspaper that he owns in the company town that he runs, where he also owns most of the housing. So he's now telling all of the people whose housing he owns, whose jobs he controls, you know who's actually the problem? It's these Jews. And that's what Henry Ford does. And he distributes it to pretty much every Ford dealership in the country, because back then dealerships are owned directly by the company, not through subsidiaries. And you could go and pick up a Model T and a copy of The International Jew. Fun for the family that day. So the Roaring Twenties is a big period of an explosion of anti-Black and anti-Semitic movements in the United States. And in the Great Depression, we see this start to go and become even further sharpened. So there's a business plot that fails to overthrow FDR. Again, something that's largely forgotten. The most decorated military officer in US history at the time, Smedley Butler, goes and blows the whistle on it to Congress. They have one congressional hearing, then Congress shuts it down and never talks about it again. Largely because there are several congressmen who are implicated in it, along with George W. Bush's grandfather, Prescott. Many people are implicated in this, and they just say, whoopsies, we won't do a coup this time. But just because they didn't get punished doesn't mean they didn't stop. They continue going and funding quite a few of these movements. And amass popular front politics of multiracial, multi-faith coalition of socialists, communists, sharecroppers, trade unions, Democrats, Republicans, because the parties weren't that different back then. People weren't as polarized back then along party lines. A huge movement of people organizes to push back these movements that are funded by quite a few of these wealthy magnates during the Great Depression. So next slide. Here's some of those prophets of deceit. That's also the name of that book from the 40s that I mentioned earlier. So Henry Ford, already gone over him quite a bit, but here we've got Father Coughlin. Father Coughlin was like the original of the shock jock radio hosts. So at his peak, he had like 25, 30 million listeners, which think the United States is about a third of the population size that it is now at the time. And his radio show went into Canada too. But Father Coughlin is a big part of popularizing the concept of Judeo-Bolshevism. The Jews are simultaneously responsible for both capitalism and communism. Make it make sense. But he popularizes this stuff throughout a lot of parts of the United States. He has quite a few listeners here, especially in Wisconsin and Minnesota, and also Ontario. That's where his big listenership is. It's through the Great Lakes region. Father Coughlin was actually finally taken off the radio because that's when FDR started enforcing and coming out with the original FCC, with the regulations that we have not actually had since the 1980s. The Fairness Doctrine, that hasn't existed since 1988. The owning multiple stations within one city, you're allowed to do that since 1996. So Father Coughlin was taken down because we actually had good, strong regulations to deal with agitators like this. Well, we also have Charles Lindbergh. Lindbergh is a pride of Minnesota, also not a good dude. So Charles Lindbergh, we mostly remember him for his flight across the Atlantic or the kidnapping of his child, but he was a prominent fascist figure. And like Ford, his activism in the America First movement gained the admiration of Europe's fascists. Both Ford and Lindbergh received some of the highest accolades from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy that non-Germans and non-Italians could get. Both of them were awarded the equivalent of like the Congressional Medal of Freedom that we have. That's like the highest thing for someone who's non-military. They were awarded those by Nazi Germany and fascist Italy because they were viewed as like-minded friends of those movements. And both of these men, and him too, all of them funded a movement here in Minnesota called the Silver Legion, also known as the Silver Shirts. The Silver Shirts were the largest fascist movement in the United States, bigger than the German Nazi Bund, which people do remember because there's big pictures from their rally at Madison Square Garden. But the Silver Legion had a bigger following across the US. The biggest places where they had followings were Minneapolis, Seattle, Los Angeles, Portland, and Asheville, North Carolina. I mention all of those because today, that's actually where you see a lot of our biggest anti-fascist movements crop up. And you may ask, why? Well, it's because these battles have been going on for 80, 90 years. People learn these stories from their uncles, from their aunts, from their grandparents. And about every 30 years, within many of these cities, you have seen people's movements push back on resurgent fascist groups. 30 years ago, you saw a similar pushback against Nazis entering the punk scene. And I've got a book on that, and there's a great Twin Cities Public Television documentary about the group of punk rockers who kicked all these Nazis out of their scene. The Silver Legion are that moment that introduces these organized fascist movements to quite a few of these cities that we view as progressive. This is supposed to be the pushback against that force of progressivism. And this was a very organized movement. And I'll tell you the story about how they were run out of Minnesota. There's currently an exhibition at Carleton College run by my friend Brooks Turner, all about the battles between the Silver Legion and labor unionists here in Minnesota. It's a fantastic exhibition. It runs through November. And I learned this story from him. So the Silver Legion, their leader, he's from North Carolina. He took the train all the way up to St. Paul. He was going to be doing a rally in Minneapolis. This is 1938, 4 years after the big Teamster strike here. And workers were ready to go and fight back against this stuff. And guy gets picked up at the train station. Cabby's a union man. Back then, you did not have the radio in the car. So he said, I have to go make a call to dispatch real quick. So he goes, hops in the phone booth. Instead, he calls his union friend and says, hey, I've got the leader of the Silver Shirts here. I'm taking him to their convention hall. I'm gonna take the longest possible route to get there, because none of these people have Google Maps, they don't know the actual directions. I need you to get as many people out there as possible. And through the phone trees that they had built, through the neighborhood, organizing they had done, where they knew, oh, my guys, they live in this building, this building, this building. They went and they organized 4,000 people within an hour to go and form a giant human barrier in front of that convention hall. They outnumbered the Silver Shirts, 3-1. All the Silver Shirts were just shaking in their polished boots inside. And the leader of the Silver Shirts, he looks out the cab window and says, take me back to the train station. He never comes back to Minnesota, and the Silver Legion organized one other event in Minneapolis. 3 weeks later, 10 people show up to it, and then they stop organizing here. That is how they were beaten. They weren't beaten through suing them. They weren't beaten through the ballot box. They were beaten through being shown that they are truly unpopular directly to their faces. Next slide. So after this movement, after that moment though, World War II comes around. It suddenly is unpopular to identify as a fascist while we're fighting the fascists in World War II. So a lot of these people kind of go underground. They suddenly become hyper patriotic. Oh, I never was truly interested in Nazi Germany, just in America and all of that stuff. So a lot of these guys rebrand. We start to go and see Jim Crow fall apart in the decades after World War II. Civil rights movement in the 50s and 60s, we start seeing direct groups like the Klan. They're actually starting to be prosecuted because civil rights organizers are actually organizing and agitating the federal government to actually enforce laws that have been on the books for 100 years that were never enforced. So the Klan is starting to be prosecuted, and the Klan starts to retreat. And there's many civil rights victories that are coming through the courts, but largely, the courts are not the source of these. It is the huge people's movements. It's not just the sit-in, it is huge student protests. It's massive walkouts. It's massive strikes from Black Americans across the United States, and some allies. So after the Civil Rights Act, mass resistance to desegregation finds new outlets. So many white communities in the United States had formed white councils in the 1950s to go and resist anything from Black communities. And then coming around after the Civil Rights Movement, these white citizens leagues started to shift away from trying to stop Black communities from protesting or organizing to now using the exact same tactics that they saw communities use. They're going to go and do, and just in the same way the Civil Rights Movement did mass resistance to segregation, these groups did mass resistance to desegregation. This is where the busing controversies come around, manufactured controversies. And this ends up leading to groups finding new allies. The Klan used to hate Catholics. They used to hate Catholics honestly as much as they hated Jews. But during this time period, the Klan starts to realize, hey, you know what, these white Catholics in like New Orleans, there's a couple of congregations that specifically formed parochial schools in order to avoid being in integrated classrooms. Some of these Protestant Klan groups were like, wait a minute, you know what? We have something in common. And this is how we start seeing a cross-pollination of some of these movements. It used to be that many Protestant congregations in the United States, specifically politicized ones, did not have an interest in abortion prior to this time period. During this time period, as there was a cross-pollination during the resistance to desegregation, abortion issues, which were largely viewed as a Catholic thing, start coming into things like the Southern Baptist Convention and others, and into some of these evangelical movements that are largely led out of, oh gosh, the guys who opened up Liberty University, those televangelists.
Sure.
The Falwells and their ilk. So this is where they form this network, and this is where the professional coalitions of lawyers and businessmen invest in a long-term culture and legal war to roll back civil rights of all sorts. Be it women's bodily autonomy, be it the Civil Rights Act, be it labor rules, you name it. It's largely a coalition of these people through the Falwell machine, through the John Birch Society, and a few of these other groups during that time period. A fantastic book which I did not bring with me specifically about this, it's called Democracy in Chains, and specifically about that long-term legal organization battle.
It said power off.
Powered off the screen.
Oh,
So,
this.
lastly, post 9/11, no secret, as we're seeing a resurgence of the mass paranoia right now. Post 9/11, a massive, we can just stay on this.
Okay.
A massive paranoia, of course, strikes the nation. A ton of Islamophobia is introduced to a ton of Americans who have honestly probably never heard of Islam before that day. And now all they can go and view is people as subhuman, as, oh, they are part of this barbaric religion from the other side of the world, and we must fear them. So Crusader imagery becomes incredibly popular across the West. And this is a point in time where you see a massive cross-pollination of American white nationalist movements with European ones. Because during the same time period, there is both the international rhetoric across European and American media that this is a war between the West and the Middle East, that this is a clash of cultures. So they're hearing this a lot. Also, the internet comes around and people have the ability to Google Translate stuff. And though Google Translate's not very good at getting you context, white nationalists don't particularly care. They're not really into the nuances of linguistics and language. They really just want to share how to make a bomb in as many languages as possible. So this is when you start seeing a lot of these groups starting to go and communicate. Because back in the 1980s, prior to the internet, if you were from one terroristic white nationalist group, let's say in England, and then there was a group in the United States, if you wanted to communicate with each other, it was real easy to tap the phone line. It was real easy to intercept that mail package between those two groups for authorities to keep track of these. It's a lot harder to do that when they can just do it online. And now they can jump across linguistic barriers because these people, they're not interested in learning new languages. They're barely interested in learning new things. So now they have the ability to communicate with each other to people in Ukraine, to people in Sweden, to people in Serbia, to as many people as they want across the barriers of distance and language. And this is why you're starting to see these movements have a shared ideology. And that shared ideology, and I'm almost done, this is the second to last slide, is the Great Replacement. Once upon a time, it was a niche thing. It's much older than the 1980s when we really look at it culturally. But as a full-throated conspiracy theory, it came from a 1980s neo-Nazi phrase called the 14 words. I'm not going to repeat it. It's basically like we can't replace our children with other people's. Just insert white like 5 times, like 5 of the 14 words, just white. But the important part is it's about this concept of that a white culture is going to be collapsing in, that they are being outpopulated by people from other places and undone from within. This is a long-standing paranoia within European culture. This existed in the 1920s. Woodrow Wilson, again, great dude, right? Passes a package of anti-immigration laws that create a quota system for people from all over the world. The biggest quotas are from the United Kingdom and France and Germany, you know, the good places, and then everywhere else gets like 10 people a year. We didn't eliminate the quota system until like the 1970s. But that quota system came around because of a similar paranoia in the 1920s, that people from inferior cultures were coming into the United States and undoing it. And the Great Replacement is just the new version of it. It's this fantasy that a white identity is being erased from a wave of people from other backgrounds and cultures. Next slide. But the thing is that one, you don't need to go and have a fancy degree or a background in any of these things to be able to identify it. People have identified it for a long time. Decolonial theorists identified it back in the 1960s. People were identifying in the 1920s. But even the members of Public Enemy, the hip hop group from the late 1980s, identified this as well in their concept album Fear of a Black Planet in 1988. You don't have to be completely enveloping every single book to see that this cultural paranoia exists. And why is this a unifying element for a lot of these groups? Well, it's a story that takes that social malaise. It takes that identification that there is something not quite right about society right now, right? That there are a lot of problems happening right now. And it redirects it with an extremely familiar catalog of racist ideas present in Europe and present in American white European culture, right? So it takes that identification that, wow, the dollar's not going as far as it used to. Wow, it's really hard to find a job these days. And it redirects it to, well, it must be because of this immigrant group. It must be because these people, not you, you've been following the rules. These people are breaking the rules. And it takes that already existing rhetorical device and attaches it to a long, long familiar cultural history of racist ideas that are here in the US and in Europe. And central to that fantasy is that Jews are orchestrating politics that will result in white people being outpopulated. So it's not just, oh, immigrants are coming across the border. It's Jews are purposely making immigrants cross the border to go and replace us. So it's both of these things combined that make Great Replacement slightly different than other forms of race baiting fear that we've seen in the past. I think maybe there's one more after this. Perfect, great. This is a quote from a fantastic essay from Peter Beinart, who is the, I think he still is editor-in-chief of Jewish Currents, or at least he was at the time. His term might have ended. But this was written just after the massacre in Buffalo, New York last year. So like other white nationalists, the Buffalo shooter must resolve a contradiction. If Black and brown people are inferior, how have they managed to, quote, invade and nearly conquer the Western world? Here's where Jews come in. Since Jews are malevolent in a different way, morally degenerate, but supremely cunning, they control and manipulate the invaders from the global South. In one montage, the shooter identifies the Jews behind the NAACP, because of course, Black Americans could not possibly run their own civil rights organization. It must be somebody else. And Jews don't only control other racial and ethnic groups, we're behind the movement of transgender rights too. And that brings us back to that first image I shared with us today, where that is a core part of where we're seeing these movements go. Now, it is not only Jews run the NAACP or insert any other organization, it's also Jews must be running queer advocacy organizations, et cetera. So this goes into a long history and just repackaged with new shiny things. I know we're at time, so I'm happy to answer questions, tell you all about books. There's a third part that I can always come back and do, which is all about the internet. I've been studying with folks from American University, working at they have a research lab called Peril that looks at how people are radicalized into extremism online. And they're looking at ways to prevent that. It's way harder to de-radicalize somebody. When somebody's gone all the way down the hole, it's real hard to pull them out. But it's way easier to go and redirect them earlier on. And I've been working with folks from American University on that for a while. And highly recommend their resources. They've got great ones out there for folks who are teachers, parents, and in congregations.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Anybody have any questions? The question was, when's he coming back? Well, Sheila and I'll be sitting down soon and we're not, the next step, the internet.
Always happy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think one thing that I found fascinating is during the 80s and 90s, the Klan in the South started to direct their anger away from Blacks and more towards Hispanics and Asians, especially along the Gulf Coast fishing. And it was almost like they were telling their members, don't hate the Blacks so much. We gotta go after these people because they're the real danger.
Yep.
And you see that now as well in other groups, that it's all, our cancer is the immigrants. It's all the immigrants. And it's, geez, man,
Yeah.
when are we gonna get away from them? And what do we do to get away from them?
Yeah. Yeah, a really big part of these movements is they will redirect once a group, because the thing, kind of like that story about the silver shirts,
Yeah,
at their core, a lot of these movements are cowards.
Yeah.
Deeply afraid of everything. It's why their ideology is built around such fear. And when you see groups like the Klan go and restructure and start to go and focus on Hispanic immigrants or Southeast Asian immigrants in the Gulf Coast, it's because at that point in time, they realized that Black communities in the South had beaten them, right? They had lost the civil rights battle against them. And also, often forgotten, Black communities armed themselves against the Klan. The Klan used to go and do like nighttime raids and daytime raids. They stopped doing that in the 50s. And it wasn't just because like they were starting to be prosecuted. It's actually because there was a large movement of people to go and also engage in well-trained self-defense, not forming militias, roaming the streets. But if you come to my house, you're getting shot back at. And that the Klan retreated from that. And then they went to immigrant groups because they're like, well, they can't purchase a weapon right now. I can bully them. And you see a very similar thing today with targeting queer communities. It's easier to target a community that is 1% of the population than 15% or 20 or 30%. Yeah.
Yeah, you talked about the Russian Revolution, Bolshevism, and all that, and the paranoia that came from that. Well, I happen to have my parents and my grandparents were both refugees following the Russian Revolution. They were Germans in Russia. And some of them came to North America, here in Canada, where we're from. And some ultimately had to stay to get out. And they came retreated with the German army back into Germany. So within the Mennonite groups, and the Mennonites and Germans in Russia, within that group, the ones that came here now didn't have any anti-Semitism in their thought. We didn't grow up with any of that kind of stuff. But the ones that went back to Germany, and were in Germany for a period of time, that was really picked up. So there was a reason to be concerned about Russian communism. There's a good reason to be concerned about it. But did the white supremacist groups, they just take almost any event in the world and blame the Jews? I mean, that's something I learned here, is that almost any event that they could somehow attach the Jews to, they did.
Pretty much, yeah. Like deep at their core, these movements are full of opportunists, right?
Yeah.
They have a specific fantasy for a worldview that they want, and every crisis is an opportunity to pop in a new wedge and try growing. So like right now, one of my friends who's a researcher on this stuff, and something I've observed is that like, while the vast majority, I've been to many of these myself in my personal time, of like protests that are like run by Palestinians, just advocating for please stop bombing us, right? There are groups of white nationalists who are trying to go and view that as an opportunity to come in and try grabbing specifically the white people who show up and redirecting them towards their movements. The same way that they looked at the punk rock movement as, well, there's a bunch of kids who are real upset with the system right now. I'm gonna go and try pulling some of them along. And each crisis presents an opportunity, whether or not the crisis itself actually makes any sense with their ideology.
Whatever your politics is, but isn't it clear from the recent politics in this country that propaganda really works?
Oh, propaganda is incredibly powerful.
This is master propaganda.
Yes.
And they're really good at that, but they're very dangerous. And you take people that are hurting, you can find something to blame and find to fix it. To me personally, that comes from both the right and the left. I don't want to get.
Oh, yeah. No, everybody engaged in propaganda.
Problem, just come to me.
Yeah, everybody's trying to sell us something. When I traveled to Eastern Europe this year and went to a whole bunch of sites across what used to be Yiddish land, where the vast majority of the shtetls were, where the vast majority of Eastern European Jews lived. And the scholar who was traveling with us during those 10 days, the genocide studies scholar who was born and raised in the town outside of Auschwitz, he's about 10 years older than me. So he grew up during those final years of the Polish communist government. One thing he told all of us, because this bus was full of Americans, was that one thing that people who were growing up during that time period in communist Poland knew how to do was sniff out the bullshit. They knew how to sniff out the BS. And they could tell when the government was lying about something because it didn't align with what was actually going on. One thing that he wanted to impart to all of us is that we should not be so arrogant in the West to think that the same doesn't happen to us. And he's like, that's the problem that you see even in Poland right now. Communism's gone, but people are still eating up the BS because people don't know how to read through it anymore. And the similar thing here, we kind of got used to the idea that everybody's Walter Cronkite, right? But there hasn't been a Walter Cronkite in decades. And we forget everybody's selling us something. All of our major, like we have 5 major media corporations that own 90% of all television, radio, and print. And that's gonna create a propaganda problem. Whether or not they're intentionally doing it, it's gonna have a very, very different perspective than if you have tons and tons of different community newspapers that are able to compete with them. So even, I think some of my favorite British activists said, take a propaganda, it's all propaganda. Which is funnier in a British accent. But yeah, everybody's trying to sell us something, and some people are very, very good at it.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you all. They'll be planning for what's next, spring?
Right.
Yeah. It comes some. Awesome. That is for you.
Thank you so much.
Yes.
Happy to be here.
Yes. Thank you.
Yeah. And this slide deck is available if you want to share it with anybody else.
Awesome.
Make it and they're like, oh my gosh.
I recorded the presentation, so I might try to like put the certain slides up in the
Great.
video too, so we'll see.
Great.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting me back. I'm happy